In 1846, Congressman Jefferson Davis of Mississippi presented to the House of Representatives a resolution calling for the replacement of federal troops in all coastal forts by state militia. The proposal died in committee, and shortly thereafter, Davis resigned from Congress to lead the red-shirted 1st Mississippi Rifles to war and glory in Mexico. Now, it was the morning of April 10, 1861, and Davis was president of the newly proclaimed Confederate States of America. As he met with his cabinet in a Montgomery, Alabama hotel room, he had good reason to regret the failure of that resolution 15 years earlier. For had it passed, he would not have had to make the decision he was about to make. Order Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, commander of Confederate forces at Charleston, South Carolina, to demand the surrender of the federal garrison on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. But before Davis made this decision, other men had made other decisions. A fateful trail of decisions leading to that Montgomery hotel room on the morning of April 10, 1861. In a sense, the first of those decisions went back to 1829, when the War Department dumped tons of granite rubble brought from New England on a sand spit at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. On the foundation, so formed a fort named after South Carolina Revolutionary War hero Thomas Sumter was built. However, it was built very slowly, as Congress appropriated the needed money in driblets. 31 years later, it was over 80% complete, though without a garrison and with most of its cannons unmounted. Even so, potentially, it was quite formidable. Surrounded by the sea, its 5-sided brick walls stood 50 feet high, buried in thickness from 12 feet at the base to 8.5 feet at the top. Adequately manned, gunned, and supplied, it could, and in fact eventually would, resist most powerful assaults. 3 1/3 miles northwest across the harbor lay Charleston. And here on December 20th, 1860, a state convention voted unanimously that, quote, the union now subsisting between South Carolina and other states under the name the United States of America is hereby dissolved, unquote. During the rest of that day and all through the night, jubilant crowds celebrated. To South Carolinians, the election of the, quote, black Republican, unquote, Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in November had been tantamount to a declaration of war by the North on the South. They had responded by secession. The doctrine so long advocated by their great leader, John C. Calhoun, now lying in Charleston's St. Philip's churchyard beneath a marble monument, soon, they were confident, the other slave states would join them in forming a glorious Southern Confederacy. Meanwhile, South Carolina would be a nation among nations. For that reason, the continued presence of, quote, foreign, unquote, United States troops in the forts which controlled Charleston's harbor was more than irritating. It was intolerable. They must go. Hopefully, the federal government would pull them out. To that end, Governor Francis Pickens of South Carolina appointed 3 commissioners to go to Washington and negotiate the evacuation of the forts. But if the troops did not leave voluntarily, they would have to be removed. That did not appear difficult to accomplish. Hundreds of militia, Citadel cadets, and freelance volunteers were gathering in Charleston, spoiling for a fight. In contrast, the United States soldiers numbered a scant 85, 9 officers and 76 enlisted men, of whom 8 of the latter were musicians. Furthermore, nearly all of those troops were stationed in Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, designed to repel a sea attack. This fort was practically defenseless on its land side. Overlooking it were high sand dunes from which riflemen could slaughter the garrison. In 1780, Major Richard Anderson gallantly but unsuccessfully defended the original Fort Moultrie against British assault. 80 years later, his son, Major Robert Anderson of the 1st United States Artillery, arrived at the new Fort Moultrie and took command of the Federal troops stationed at Charleston. Secretary of War John B. Floyd of the lame duck Buchanan administration personally selected him for the post in November 1860. 55, a West Pointer, and twice promoted for bravery in battle, he was an experienced and competent officer, exactly what was needed at Charleston. Moreover, his background should have been reassuring to the Carolinians. As a Kentuckian, he qualified as a Southerner. He had owned slaves, and his wife came from an aristocratic Georgia family. Indeed, it was just possible that Floyd, a Virginian, hoped that the major would do what he himself was already doing: support secession. If so, Floyd had picked the wrong man. Anderson may have been a Southerner, but was dedicated to, quote, duty, honor, country, unquote. Above all, he was resolved to do everything in his power consistent with those principles to avoid a clash at Charleston that might plunge the nation into civil war. That is why Fort Moultrie's vulnerability alarmed him. As early as November 23, he reported to the War Department that the Carolinians have, quote, a settled determination to obtain possession of this work, unquote. Since they had made their determination even more evident, should they attack, duty would compel him, despite the odds, to resist. And that meant war. Hence, he decided to transfer his troops to Fort Sumter. There they would be much more secure, and so would peace. For on being confronted with a target less tempting than Moultrie, presumably the Carolinians would be less bellicose. To be sure, Floyd had instructed him on December 11th to, quote, avoid every act which would needlessly tend to provoke, unquote, the Carolinians. But Floyd had also authorized him to move his command to either of the two forts in Charleston Harbor should he have, quote, tangible evidence of a design to proceed to a hostile act, unquote. He ignored a, quote, confidential, unquote, letter from Floyd received December 23, which in effect urged him to surrender the forts rather than, quote, make a vain and useless sacrifice of your life and the lives of the men under your command, upon mere point of honor, unquote. Also, he was unaware that on December 10, President Buchanan had informally promised a group of South Carolina congressmen that no change would be made in the military status quo at Charleston. The transfer to Fort Sumter took place December 26th and 27th. Private John Thompson described how it was managed in a letter to his father in Ireland. Our commander set about fortifying himself in Moultrie, with which unparalleled vigor that our opponents soon became thoroughly convinced that he intended to make a desperate stand in that position he then held. And the duty of watching us was performed with a laxity corresponding to the strength of their conviction. So completely did our commander keep his own counsel that none in the garrison, officer or soldier, even dreamed that he had contemplated a move. On the night of 26 December, shortly after sundown, we were formed in heavy marching order and quietly marched out of Moultrie, leaving only a few men behind on guard, and embarking on board a number of small boats, were safely landed in Sumter. Several schooners carrying food, munitions, medical supplies, and 45 army wives and children followed the soldiers. In the morning, the rear guard also made the crossing after spiking Moultrie's cannons and setting fire to their carriages. The column of smoke which rose from the Moultrie merely confirmed what had been reported in Charleston by the crew of a harbor patrol boat. The Federals had slipped away to Sumter. The Carolinians fumed with anger and chagrin, and Governor Pickens promptly sent Colonel J. Johnston Pettigrew to the fort. Pettigrew accused Anderson of breaking Buchanan's December 10 promise to maintain the existing military situation at Charleston. Anderson replied, truthfully enough, that he knew of no such promise, and that he had every right to move to Sumter, and that he had done so to protect his men and prevent bloodshed. Quote, in this controversy between the North and South, unquote, he added, quote, my sympathies are entirely with the South, unquote. But his duty came first. Quote, well, sir, unquote, said Pettigrew with a bow. Quote, however that may be, the governor of the state directs me to say this to you, courteously but peremptorily, to return to Fort Moultrie, unquote. Quote, I will not go back, unquote, answered Anderson. Pettigrew left. Soon afterward, at noon, Anderson assembled his troops on Sumter's parade ground. Chaplain Matthias Harris delivered a prayer of thanksgiving, then to the accompaniment of the band playing, quote, Hail Columbia, unquote. Anderson personally raised the United States flag that he had brought from Moultrie to the top of a pole where it waved above the fort. In Charleston, Pickens, upon learning that Anderson refused to return to Moultrie, ordered the state troops to seize that fort. Castle Pinckney and the federal arsenal, treasury, custom house, and post office. He believed that he was carrying out justified retaliation against aggression. Instead, he committed a bad blunder. Buchanan would retain constitutional powers of presidency until March 4th, 1861. However, he no longer possessed its moral and political authority. He was old and tired, and his overriding desire was to finish out his term in peace, and with the nation still at peace. To that end, he sought to appease the South and thus prevent war. The North, he declared, was to blame for the sectional crisis. Secession, he announced, was unconstitutional, but so would be any attempt of the federal government to resist it by, quote, coercion, unquote. He refused to reinforce the tiny garrison at Charleston, and even ordered it to return muskets and ammunition it drawn from its own arsenal. This was in keeping with its December 10 promise to the South Carolina congressman, which, along with the instructions sent to Anderson, he hoped would keep the Charleston powder keg from exploding. On December 26, the three commissioners appointed by Pickens to negotiate the evacuation of Charleston's forts arrived in Washington. William Trescott, a South Carolinian who was acting as an intermediary, informed Buchanan of their arrival and purpose. Buchanan replied he would see them, quote, as private gentlemen, unquote, and that he would submit to Congress their proposal that the forts and other federal facilities in Charleston be turned over to South Carolina in exchange for a fair monetary compensation. The following morning, the commissioners were discussing matters in the mansion Trescott had rented for them when a burly, bearded man came slamming through the door. He was Senator Lewis T. Wigfall of Texas, a native South Carolinian and fanatical secessionist. A telegram, he announced, had arrived from Charleston. Anderson had spiked his guns at Moultrie and moved his troops to Sumter. The commissioners refused to believe it. So did Secretary of War Floyd, who also showed up. Then came another telegram from Charleston confirming the first. Trescott, accompanied by two Southern leaders, Senators Jefferson Davis of Mississippi and Robert M.T. Hunter of Virginia, hastened to the White House. Davis told the president the news from Charleston. Buchanan was dumbfounded. Quote, I call God to witness, unquote, he exclaimed. Quote, this is not only without, but against my orders. It is against my policy, unquote. The Southerners urged him to order Anderson back to Moultrie. Otherwise, they warned, South Carolina almost surely would seize the other forts, attack Sumter, and begin civil war. But he refused to do so until he consulted with his cabinet. At the cabinet meeting, Floyd charged that Anderson had disobeyed his orders. Secretary of State Jeremiah S. Black, a Pennsylvanian, disagreed. To settle the issue, Buchanan and his secretaries examined a copy of Anderson's December 11 instructions. There it was, the authorization to leave Moultrie, quote, whenever you have tangible evidence of a design to proceed to a hostile act, unquote. Obviously, what constituted, quote, tangible evidence, unquote, had to be determined by Anderson. And he had so determined. Nevertheless, Floyd, who had been asked several days previously by Buchanan to resign for having misappropriated $870,000 of government funds, insisted that Anderson be ordered back to Moultrie. Unless this was done, he argued, Buchanan would be guilty of breaking his, quote, pledge, unquote, to South Carolina congressman. Attorney General Edwin Stanton, backed by the other Northern Cabinet members, took a different view. Quote, a president of the United States who would make such an order, unquote, he asserted, quote, would be guilty of treason, unquote. Quote, oh no, not so bad as that, my friend, unquote, cried Buchanan in dismay, quote, not so bad as that, unquote. The cabinet meeting ended without a decision. Several days later, Floyd finally resigned. Eventually, as commander of Confederate forces at Fort Donelson, he would render great service to the Union cause. On December 28, the South Carolina commissioner visited the White House. They demanded that Anderson's troops be removed from Charleston Harbor, quote, as they are standing menace which renders negotiations impossible and threatens a bloody issue, unquote. They also pressed for an immediate reply to this ultimatum. Again, Buchanan refused to commit himself. Quote, you don't give me time to consider. You don't give me time to say my prayers. I will always say my prayers when required to act upon a great state affair, unquote. As Trescott shrewdly noted, Buchanan had, quote, a fixed purpose to be undecided, unquote, yet he could not avoid making a decision much longer. What would it be? His impulse was to grant the Carolinians their demand. Anything to forestall war, but he felt countervailing pressures. The North cheered Anderson's action and hailed the pro-Southern major as a hero. To repudiate what he had done by ordering him to evacuate Sumter would raise a storm that might result in impeachment. Moreover, Black, a close friend, declared that he would resign if the Sumter garrison was pulled out. And undoubtedly, the Northern cabinet members would follow suit. What tipped the balance, however, was Pickens' seizure of Moultrie, Pinckney, and other federal installations in Charleston. This was, Black pointed out, an act of aggression which could not be justified. It was also something which could not be ignored by a president of the United States without violating his oath of office. Hence, on December 30, Buchanan sent a reply, drafted by Black, to the South Carolina commissioners, after referring to the, quote, armed action, unquote, taken by South Carolina against federal property in Charleston. Buchanan stated, quote, it is under these circumstances that I am urged immediately to withdraw troops from the harbor of Charleston, and am informed that without this, negotiation is impossible. This I cannot do. This I will not do, unquote. Instead, Sumter would be defended and, quote, I do not perceive how such a defense can be construed into a menace of the city of Charleston, unquote. Having thus decided, Buchanan next gave the commanding general of the army, Winfield Scott, the go-ahead on a plan proposed by him earlier, to send the warship Brooklyn with supplies and 250 troops from Fort Monroe in Virginia to reinforce Sumter.